Good morning and welcome to the Point. This week, of course, we look back at Decision 2014. We can't do it all in a half an hour or maybe even in several hours, but we start with the two men who were in charge of their respective parties' campaigns for the State House. First, with Representative Aric Nesbitt for the Republicans. Let's start with the results from Tuesday, and I'm going to give you a scenario and you will disagree with it, and then we'll move from there. I looked at this race going in that because the numbers were tight in the governor's race and because it was a little hard to find a real true trend, because we had, at one point, we had Mark Schauer was trending up in the polls and the governor was trending down, depending on which polls you looked at. One of our polls, the polls we use, had the governor up by 8, and the next week he was only up by 2. Ends up winning by 4. But the overall is that you in the House picked up seats over in the Senate, which was an impossibility, it seemed to me. It looks, at least for now, like you've picked up a seat. What happened in this election? What does this result tell you? And were you surprised, as some of us were?
Yeah, I think the election came down to really looking at it is who is delivering real results for Michigan. They've seen the mess out in Washington, D.C., the dysfunction, not being able to pass budgets, increasing debt, not being able to create good policy. And compared to Michigan, where you've been seeing the last 4 years real results being delivered by the governor and by the House Republican majority and by the Senate Republican majority, and you saw that as a vote of confidence by the voters here in Michigan. And it also, the quality of the candidates that were running on our side, people that were good consensus builders, people that wanted to get real results and deliver those results by growing jobs, investing in education, investing in roads, making those tough decisions. They weren't looking for empty political talking points or the real negative false campaigns that we saw. And I think it was a rejection of some of the huge negative campaigning that was going on. The rejection that the fact is we've increased $1 billion into education, unlike what the Democrats and Mark Schauer had said. The fact that we changed the tax structure and the tax code to provide a fair and more equitable tax reform package that is fair to all seniors as they turn 67, instead of providing special handouts to certain groups. The same thing we did with business taxes. Instead of having special exemptions, that we went ahead and did a flat corporate income tax rate. And the fact that the state is growing and that debt's being paid down, $20 billion of less debt, 300,000 new private sector jobs. So I think it's a combination of delivering real results, of rejecting the false negative campaigns, and having really good candidates such as Holly Hughes or Dr. Bizon or Margaret O'Brien that are individuals that will work together to make sure that we're moving the state forward.
When you talk about quality candidates and real performance, certainly from the narrative of your party, that's part of what you said during the campaign, part of what you wanted to do. The reality is turnout was down by almost 2%, despite the best efforts of both the Republican Party and the Democrats. And the polling was still close. I mean, when you woke up on Tuesday morning, did you expect to wake up on Wednesday morning with additional members in the House, a Republican governor, and 27 seats in the Senate?
I have faith in the people of Michigan and being able to make the right decisions and coming out. And it was a mix of turnout. Some seats they were a little higher, some seats they were lower. I know in Detroit it was a higher turnout than what they had 4 years ago, from what I've seen. In other seats, I think it does come down to, in terms of being able to have quality candidates. Now, it was close. There was a lot of money that was spent on false negative campaigns that was going out. The Democratic Party invested a lot in terms of their turnout. But as you look at the difference between the direction that the state was going and the direction the federal government was going, I think it was an endorsement of moving the state forward in the right direction. And it also, I believe, some credit goes to Bobby Shostak, who chairs the Michigan Republican Party. He worked tirelessly to return a House and Senate majority and to return the governor. And you look at the governor, I mean, we're looking at Detroit coming out of bankruptcy. I know we're on the west side of the state, but it is our largest city. And I think the the economy of Southeast Detroit matters for the rest of the state. And it's an exciting time for our state as we clean up the finances and do what I call some tough love with Detroit and being able to come out of it as a better state and a better city.
You mentioned the governor. As an observer going into this election cycle, without respect to who the Democratic candidate was going to be, this governor looked like a 10-point favorite. Even if it didn't look that way on paper, you think you put a campaign together, you move this thing forward. There was no primary for Democrats, no primary for Republicans, no surprise. And Mark Schauer and the Democrats and the Democratic Governors Association got very aggressive. And by the summer, late summer, this race appeared again on paper in polling to be tied. Did you expect this race for governor to end up being within 3 or 4 points?
One thing I knew last year is that Mark Schauer is a very aggressive campaigner. He can stay on his own empty political talking points extremely well. And I believe that he's able to raise money and resources, and you've seen those come into the state. And so it's not somebody that I would underestimate ever because of the way he's able to stay on message. He's able to lie, misconstrue the truth, and stay on message and not be called out on it. However, you look at it, he never offered a real solution for Michigan. Now, maybe people don't agree with everything that the governor's done. However, the governor has shown real leadership in Michigan in terms of turning us around and getting us out of that Granholm shower era, the failed decade from before. Right? And so I do think at the end of the day, voters rewarded the governor in knowing that he did have a plan. They may not agree with him on every single piece of it, but they do agree that he's making the best decisions for the long-term health of the state. So our children and grandchildren, our friends and neighbors can stay in Michigan, can work, can raise a family, and can get a good, solid education here in the state.
Switching gears just a little bit, you had leadership elections this week, and thanks to term limits, the new Speaker of the House is rarely a household name. Not many people knew who Jay Spolger was when he was first elected as Speaker of the House. Same with Kevin Cotter, in a race that many believed might come down to he and Al Pashoka from the southwest part of the state. But it ends up being Kevin Cotter from Midland. Is that right?
Yes.
Tell us about him in terms of introduction. We'll have him on the show.
Yeah.
But tell me about what you think his style is going to be. What are his political leanings? Is he more or less conservative than the norm for the Republicans in the House?
Yeah, I came into office with Kevin Cotter. We're both going into our third term, winning our re-election on Tuesday. Kevin is chair of the Judiciary Committee, very even-tempered type of person, gets along with a lot of individuals, and is somebody that wants to work to find a consensus, but at the same time do what's right at the end of the day. I think it's somebody who wants to make sure we have a good balanced budget and a more efficient, effective government. Ensure that we have a tax system that works for the citizens of Michigan and works to allow for investments into the state. And looking at his relationships and work with the colleagues, I've seen him being able to get along with people on both sides of the aisle and trying to deliver those results. And he's been an important part of the team in the House to continue to work to reinvent Michigan.
When you, I should point out, are also in leadership, what is your role?
I'm going to be the majority floor leader, so I'm going to be managing the floor, the bills that come onto the floor, representing Southwest Michigan, and we have in the entire state. And we have a great leadership team. Tom Barrett from north of Lansing, he's going to be the Speaker Pro Tem. You have, it was announced by Speaker-elect Cotter that Representative Pasholka from Berrien County is going to be the Appropriations Chair. I have two assistant floor leaders. They're both from West Michigan. Daniela Garcia from Holland. She's going to be a very dynamic individual in the House. Excited to serve with her. And Representative Ken Yonker here from Kent County is going to be another one of my assistant floor leaders. So I look forward to working with the entire team. Representative Verheulen, also from Kent County, is going to be the majority whip in the caucus. Let's
talk a little bit about what the agenda looks like. First, for 3 weeks of terror, that's how reporters look at it, it's called lame duck. Now, it may not be quite as active as it might have been had Republicans lost the race for governor or lost control of the House, for example. You didn't lose either one of those. In fact, you come back with more people in the House, more people in the Senate. So what does lame duck look like? And I know it's a guess because nobody knows for sure what may come up.
Well, I think the top issue and the priority is going to be finishing up roads and transportation package. The House passed a package earlier this year that would put permanently an additional $500 million a year into roads and bridges. Now the goal is to get it over $1 billion at the end of the day, but a lot of times you can't get points on the board playing baseball unless you get a few singles first. And I believe this was the $500 million is a nice double. And we sent that over to the Senate. The Senate was trying to do a grand slam, and they missed it in June. But I do know that there's a lot of members that put policy above politics, like Senator Shoemaker, who is very much on the front trying to make sure the deal was done early summer, and that didn't happen, didn't quite come through. But I do think that's going to be the top priority over the next month and a half, is to get a permanent solution in roads. Now, is Republicans and with the governor, we have put an additional $870 million into roads over the last 3 budget cycles, making sure that we are starting the investment back in. And I know Representative Shirkey from Jackson has introduced legislation to grow that $500 million starting point for the House package, and over the next 4 years grow that to over $500 million in terms of permanent funding for our roads and bridges. So I do think that's going to be the top priority going into the fall.
Just got a few seconds left. Everybody expects roads to be the big issue, but there are a lot of other things floating around. And unfortunately, during lame duck, while you're waiting for the deal to get cut on roads, there are a lot of other things that can kind of pop up. Do you have any chance at taking on automobile no-fault reform in lame duck? Is that anything you're going to look at?
I know there's a package on the House floor right now. I'm on the insurance committee, and I think our auto insurance rates are too high here in Michigan. I do think they need to be more competitive. We need to have a more competitive marketplace. We need to protect individuals that do get into catastrophic accidents, while also providing consumers real relief. This has been something I hear from constituents all the time over the last several months, especially seniors on fixed incomes, and trying to protect these outrageous climbing auto insurance rates. I know the Speaker has a great interest in terms of getting something through. That could be part of it, but it's going to come down to where the votes are at and how we're able to continue on.
We'll be back with the Democratic point of view next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. Obviously, Republicans were much happier about the outcome of Tuesday night than were Democrats. Here's Brandon Dillon, a state representative who was in charge of getting Democrats elected to the state house. Well, the obvious question is, what happened? I was talking to you before we started. More than a year ago, Chairman of the Michigan Democratic Party, Lon Johnson, was showing me his new turn out the vote idea. It was sophisticated, and it was backed up with some really good lists, and in politics, lists are terribly important. But at the end of the day, we don't see the turnout.
No, I mean, if you would have told me up until 9 o'clock on election night that we were going to get a turnout that was less than 2010, I would have thought you were crazy. I mean, there were no indications, at least from polling that I saw or public polling that was available, data on absentee ballots that had been requested, just the program and the fundamentals that were there that indicated that we were going to get a turnout that was worse than the last midterm election, which was the worst since the 1920s. So it was shocking. And I think one of the initial takeaways that I have and others is it's very difficult to overcome people's perception of the president in power. For better or for worse, this was a referendum in many ways against people's feelings on Washington and the person in charge of Washington. And we've seen that in the last 3 midterm elections. In 2006, there was an aggressive wave against President Bush at the time. In 2010, we saw the initial wave against President Obama that we thought couldn't get any worse. In 2014, it did. So I do think a lot of the structural and mechanical things we did in Michigan were right in trying to identify our voters and being very targeted and sophisticated. But, all the technology in the world and the ground troops ultimately can't make people turn out if they're just turned off by what's going on in Washington and don't feel like there's any reason to get out and vote. It's a real tough problem. It's one that, I think Democrats are going to have to really look at over the next 2 to 4 years to try to figure out how we energize this coalition that seems to come together in presidential years, but then in off-year elections sits home.
And to put a little finer point on that is that Democrats haven't lost a general presidential election in the state of Michigan since 1988. So you do come together as a party on those big presidential years. So you do have voters and people out there who are, and I should point out, it wasn't always winning candidates nationwide, but in Michigan, you have always voted for that Democratic nominee since George Herbert Walker Bush won. So what is the key? And I know you don't have all the answers sitting here a few days after this, but seriously looking at the polls that showed things being close, that people were saying this may be tied going in, it still ends up being a very small margin for an incumbent governor, to be sure. But at the same time, in district after district, we saw House seats that were competitive. Holly Hughes, Colleen Lamonte, Winnie Brinks, Donnie Jo Young. You split those in being able to protect. There was one down, is it the 61st where
62nd.
The 62nd
so
down
lost.
at Portage. That would have been a pickup that looked like it was pretty competitive, and you lost that. We see that in all of those districts. Is that a matter of just really specific targeting by Republicans as well as by you guys?
Well, again, it's tough to know this early after the election, but I think one thing's clear. I mean, we do come together in presidential years, but there is some institutional and fundamental disadvantages that Democrats have in state house elections because of the way the districts are drawn. Democrats actually did get 51% of the vote statewide in state house elections, yet we're at a 63-47 disadvantage. So there is a gerrymandering effect that makes it much more difficult for us to win unless we can get the turnout that we need, and we obviously didn't get that. But in district after district in the state, we showed races that we thought were going to be very competitive based on a turnout expectation that was moderately better than 2010. We certainly weren't fooling ourselves to think we were going to get a presidential style turnout or even 2006. But ultimately, when the turnout does not turn out, for lack of a better word, the way you want, competing in seats as a Democrat where you have a moderately based Republican district is very, very tough. We had great candidates, and we had the issues on our side in some of these races, but when Republicans turn out and Democrats don't, and if those seats are tilted a little Republican, it's very difficult to overcome it.
The mantra for Democrats was, when we vote, we win. And as you point out, Democrats did not vote in the significantly higher numbers. But I want to go back to something you said earlier because I find this interesting. You were talking about the national overlay, and you were talking about the fact that people see this race through the prism of what's happening in Washington, which is the poster child for dysfunction. A president who hangs around in the mid-40s somewhere in approval, as very often presidents do in the sixth year of the two-term run. But the point you made before we started talking here on camera is that a lot of people watch that but don't watch this. In other words, they're paying attention to what's going on in Washington, but might not be in tune with who their state representative candidate is or how that race is going, because they're watching one of the cable news networks instead of watching locally. And we have seen that defection. We know that people go to that for their political news, and I would point out there's probably a corresponding lack of coverage from some local entities who don't cover this as thoroughly. So that creates a problem too, if people are focusing on the Washington news but not paying attention locally.
Yeah, well, everybody should watch your show. Let's just make sure if we could have everybody doing that, I think we'd have a much more attention paid to these local issues. And the real kind of tragic irony of all this for people who care about some of these issues, middle class fairness, public education, the real action is in midterm elections. It's not in the presidential election. You're going to see much more immediate impacts, both positive and negative, based on who controls your state legislature and who your governor is, rather than who the president is. And I do think there is kind of this increasing polarization of the media, cable news, and the filter with the internet. People kind of self-select the kind of news they want to see, and increasingly that focuses on the dysfunction in Washington. And for better or for worse, people who run on that party's label down the ticket sometimes have to struggle against that or kind of ride a wave when it's the other way. We were in districts, Rick, I will tell you, where we had polling that showed we had candidates at the State House level who looked very strong, but in those districts the president's approval rating was -40. So in retrospect, maybe the metric should be looking at what the president's approval rating is rather than how your candidate stacks up in a one-on-one race, because I think when it comes down to it, if you don't get that kind of strong turnout from your base, people tend to revert back to how they feel, their feelings on the president and their initial partisan leanings, which is really what we saw in this election.
Tip O'Neill liked to think of politics as all being local, but this almost flies in the face of that. The impact, as you point out, will be very local, but the view may have been a much more national view, at least from your perspective.
I think Tip O'Neill is one of my heroes, but I think his maxim that all politics is local is not correct anymore. There are certainly things that you can do locally. There's good politicians, good public servants that do a lot of things locally, and that can make a difference. But people used to get their news from their local newspaper. They used to get their news from, local news stations.
There weren't 24-hour news channels.
And now increasingly people are getting all their news filtered through a national lens, and that can have benefits for Democrats when the national environment is for us. But we have that issue. We also, really, I think, need to take a really hard look at what we can do to make sure that we are not just simply having the same coalition that we have currently, which seems to turn out every 2 years. There's going to be no consistency or no ability for Democrats to be successful in these state house elections and congressional elections if we can't figure out a way to make sure that we have a coalition that we can keep together to a certain degree in these kind of elections.
You can't speak for everybody in the Democratic Party, but you've got a lot of friends across the state. When you talk to them on Wednesday and on Thursday and on Friday, what's the mood in the party? Because nobody likes to lose, and with the exception of a very strong performance by Gary Peters for the U.S. Senate candidate and some state school board candidates, Democrats didn't have a great deal to cheer about in a lot of these races. What's the attitude of your colleagues and some of your friends in the party?
Well, in all honesty, I think this was a tougher election to stomach than 2010, because in 2010 there were indicators that we were heading for some major defeats, that it was going to be a very tough night. I think there was a lot more optimism going into the election on Tuesday, and the reaction to that has been a little tough. People are, I think, wondering what happened. But I do think, as with every election, you do a postmortem, you do an autopsy, and there's another election coming up. So we'll lick our wounds for a couple days, but we're going to figure out what happened, we're going to figure out how we fix it, and we're going to figure out how we win in 2016.
On Saturday and again on Monday before the election, I was with you. We were over at a local bakery when candidate Schauer came along with Melissa Gilbert campaigning with him. And then on Monday over at the 3rd Congressional District headquarters, you're exactly right about the expectation and what must have felt like internally momentum, because there were good-sized crowds and a lot of enthusiasm. So that must have been a pretty steep cliff to dive off of. But now, as you point out, there's another election. It's already begun.
Sure.
So going into that presidential year, how do you try to capitalize on what may, if history serves, be a better turnout for Democrats when it comes to local elections? In other words, try, as you pointed out a minute ago, ride that wave. How do you try to capitalize?
Well, I think, this is important for Democrats, not just in Michigan, but nationwide. I think we do have to have a process where we figure out what our message is going to be. I think we have the right values. I think most of Michigan residents and Americans understand that we're fighting for the middle class, we're fighting for public education, we're fighting for opportunity for people. I think we have to figure out how to project that message in a more positive way, instead of being just, well, they're doing this wrong. We need to have a positive vision, because I do think in an era where negative campaigning, for better or for worse, is really what you see on TV the last 3 weeks before the election, that has an effect of depressing turnout as well. And if we can offer a vision that is hopeful, we can offer an agenda that lifts people up, I think we really need to focus on that. And I do think we're going to see Republicans are now in charge. They've been in charge for a while, but they're going to be in charge more places across the state. They have a responsibility to govern. I hope they do well. I hope they are able to work with us to kind of improve the quality of life for everybody. But if history is any indication, they'll probably overreach at some point, and Democrats need to be prepared to offer a competing vision which is positive and brings in more people than we had turnout in 2014.
We're back with more To the Point in just a moment. Dissecting Decision 2014 will take more than a half an hour, more than several hours, and over the next few weeks, we'll be talking with a lot of folks who will have a different take on exactly what happened. But going forward, we'll let you know what it all means right here every Sunday, To the Point.